Okay, well, we've reached 2 o'clock, so I'm going to start, and a few more people have joined since I started talking, so welcome to you. I'm Tony Druitt, Managing Director of IT Governance, and this is the webinar. Today's webinar is about BIA, Business Impact Analysis, and risk assessment in the context of business continuity management. Those of you that attended the previous webinar about business continuity will remember that I referred to these elements a couple of times. So we're now going to go into a bit more detail about these two things. I won't dwell on this, but I've been a business continuity practitioner for quite a long time. I've been a professional member of the Business Continuity Institute since 2005, and I've implemented probably 70 to 80 business continuity management projects in a variety of organizations over the years. So I've got a rough idea of how to do it. IT governance, as many of you will know, is a one-stop shop for everything to do with governance, risk and compliance, focusing on the digital domain, if you like, on information particularly, but of course business continuity, whilst it covers a lot of things to do with information systems upon which pretty much every organization relies, obviously also deals with operational facilities as well. So we're going to be covering very much the mainstream of business continuity management, which is all about all the operational capabilities of an organization. So today we're going to go through these various points, fairly straightforward. The role of BIA and risk assessment in business continuity management from a recognized good practice point of view. We'll talk in a little bit of detail about things like criteria, outputs, and recovery priorities for business continuity. Those of you who are familiar with ISO 22301, the International Standard for Business Continuity Management, will know, of course, that although it's not written in the standard, it effectively assumes that the preferred strategy, whenever possible, is to recover the activities that have been disrupted rather than deliver the outputs of those activities in different ways. And that's very much what this approach to BIA focuses upon. Okay, so if we look at the overall role of this pair of processes, risk assessment and BIA, in the context of business continuity, this diagram is intended to indicate what goes on. We know, of course, that there are risks of disruption to all sorts of aspects of an organization. There are threats that would disrupt things. So in the top left there, we've got environmental threats, extremes of weather, which in the fair and temperate UK, we've had quite a lot of recently. In other parts of the world, of course, they may be used to much more frequent and serious environmental incidents. Various other things that can go wrong. They could be accidental, they could be deliberate, they could be attacks, they could just be things breaking or things catching on fire. There are also secondary effects, particularly if we think about cybersecurity. Often attacks may be targeted at a particular organization or a particular nation state, for example, and there is collateral damage, and so organizations can be the secondary recipient of an attack that was placed elsewhere. So we need to think about that as a source of threat. And of course, the famous PESTLE, political, environmental, social, technical, legal, and ethical, the mnemonic for remembering what type of threats may be out there if they fall into those categories. And we also have to remember that no threat is 100% likely to occur. Some of them might be 99.9 recurring, such as it will rain at some point this year in the UK. But from a business disruption point of view, threats will not definitely happen, but they may do. Of course, things are vulnerable to threats, and in order to have a risk, we must have a combination of at least a threat and a vulnerability. The sorts of things that businesses and organizations need to operate, the resources, the people, the systems, and so on, these are the things that threats may impact upon and disruption may result. And I think everybody knows that. That's a fairly well understood concept. If you've got a business resource that isn't vulnerable to something, then there is no resulting risk. But at the bottom of the list there, you can see activities, and it's the business activities, often usually, of course, called business processes, but ISO 22301 calls them activities. Those are the things that are going to get disrupted. So that's what we're particularly interested in from a risk assessment point of view. And those risks, all the risks that we identify and we analyze and evaluate, some of them will be acceptable. All of our businesses carry many, many acceptable risks, but there are some which will be unacceptable, and that depends, of course, on the organization's risk appetite. The unacceptable risks, can't just be left. They've got to have something done about them. And what we usually do with risks is try to control them, to reduce them or modify them in some way. And when it comes to operational disruption risks, we can use some combination of a business continuity management capability and or other things. So, for example, a good old-fashioned traditional risk such as flooding, we can have a business continuity capability to deal with what happens when it floods, or indeed we can maybe reduce the likelihood of flooding with some kind of flood defense system. Not everybody can do that, but it's possible. Similar things apply to other types of incident. And of course, when it comes to cyber resilience and information systems, most, if not all, organizations have got a suite of preventative controls so that we can reduce the likelihood of it happening. And the old saying, prevention is better than cure, still applies today. The risks that are unacceptable, we want to identify some kind of control strategy for, whether that's a business continuity capability, which will include a business continuity plan, or other things. That the business continuity capabilities should feed into the overall strategy for what will happen to this organization in the event of some disruption. So that identifies really the scenarios in which recovery capabilities are needed. The BIA, on the other hand, is all about identifying the recovery priorities of business activities, as I mentioned a few moments ago. So we start off with, at the center of this really are the activities or business processes. Primary ones, the things that maybe manufacture products or direct service delivery, for example, as well as secondary or supporting activities like accounting and training and things like that, and administration. All of those activities depend on resources, and the resources, we've seen those in the bottom left-hand corner, business resources. But many business activities depend on other business activities. There are lots of interdependencies between business activities in virtually every organization. And so in order to recover a disrupted activity, we need to think about the dependencies, the things that the disrupted activity will need if it's to be recovered, remembering what I said about recovery being the primary strategy implied by ISO 22301. So we identify the activities and we conduct a BIA. And what we're looking to achieve out of that BIA is the minimum business continuity objective, which is the minimum acceptable level of activity which in the view of the business or the organization, it could live with for an interim period. It could be expressed in terms of the number of people doing something, or the number of, say, telephone calls, or the number of transactions, or a variety of ways of doing it. It depends very much on the nature of the activity in question. But the basic premise is that in some kind of interim recovery state, most organizations will find it easier to recover to a level that is less than business as usual. We then also need to identify the recovery time objective. After what period of time must each activity be recovered in order to limit the impact of it being disrupted? And this is really at the center of what BIA is all about. We also need to identify through this process what dependencies, what resources and other activities would be needed and at what level in order to deliver the MBCO level of activity in the interim state. And of course, that information about what would be required to recover activities, when would they need to be recovered by, and the resources needed, that feeds into the strategy as well. And once we know the scenarios in which the unacceptable disruptions could take place, and what is required and when in order to recover the activities, we can then begin to develop a strategy. And from strategy, we can then develop business continuity plans because we know about things like recovery time objective, resource requirements, and so on. So that's how BIA and risk assessment fit into business continuity management. Now, this is a model which is taken from a variety of ISO standards. There's a generic risk assessment standard known as ISO 31000, and a number of other standards reference this particular model. And the risk assessment process behind that green square there, you can see the three key elements of it are identification, analysis, and evaluation. Identification, I think, is fairly self-evident. It's identifying the risks in the first place. Doing the analysis is some kind of scoring or measurement of the amount of risk in each case. And evaluation is the process really of deciding whether each risk is acceptable or not. It doesn't have to be yes or no, black and white. You could have various levels of acceptability, and that's for each organisation to determine what its risk appetite is and how it wants to treat risks which are anything other than minimal. The principle, if you look at the bottom left call out there, the principle of all of this, of course, is that you address the unacceptable ones and you leave the acceptable ones where they are, but you continue to monitor them. The frequency of monitoring, again, might depend upon the severity of risks. This is another way of looking at the same sort of thing, but I've just really illustrated the point about acceptable and unacceptable risks, and the unacceptable ones need a response. So it's really a very similar slide. Okay, so the first stage is risk identification. There's got to be at least one threat, at least one vulnerability, otherwise there really is no risk. And all risks do comprise some threat vulnerability pair. On the left there, I've indicated a variety of reasonably well-known threats. There are all sorts of other ones as well. In some organizations, for example, the supply of money might be an operational disruption threat, as opposed to it being, for example, a strategic liquidity threat, which is of a different nature. If the supply of money disrupts operations, then the organization might decide that that is a business continuity risk. It's for the organization to determine. Things like fires and explosions and floods and so on, they're fairly well known. Cyber attacks and other information system failures, of course, well known as well, but not necessarily attributed to business continuity. Often these are attributed to things like privacy, data protection, really probably because that affects private individuals, whereas the organizational operational disruptions tend to affect the corporation and not the individual, so they don't tend to get as much media coverage. Supply chain failure is another good one, because an organization that processes something that it receives from the supply chain, if the supply chain fails, then it can't do anything and it's operationally disrupted. It's got the customers or the clients, it's got the money, it's got the desire to do it. The only thing it hasn't got is the incoming supply that it needs to do its job. So that's another typical business continuity disruption, which is a little bit different from the traditional fire and flood type. And on the right, the examples of things that an organization has that are vulnerable to these threats, be they buildings and workplaces and things like manufacturing and processing facilities, through to the example I've said at the bottom, which is money, analog. Let's not forget analog information or non-digital, paper, hard copy. Most organizations have still got significant amounts of this that they do rely upon. And of course, the point about analog information is it's much harder to back up than digital information. Some organizations do it, but it's a less automatic and more awkward process. Remembering there are things like vehicles and importantly people. All organizations require people to operate in some way. Some are more dependent on people than others. And of course, they're the hardest things to have spare ones of. You can't back up your people. You can't have a spare set of people to come along and do the work that others have done that have been disabled in some way. And risk identification really is the business of identifying these threat vulnerability pairs, and there are various techniques for doing it. Simply walking around and looking is a pretty good way. Interviewing the owners of business processes is another way. Questionnaires, which often produce slightly more comprehensive information, is another way, and there are lots of other ways of doing them, but it is really just a case of somebody with a risk-oriented mindset looking at the organization and deciding what sort of risks might apply to operational disruption. Now this red, amber, green type of heat map or risk matrix is very well known to most people. You've only got to search for risk management or something on the internet, and you'll find lots and lots of graphics like this. This is a very typical way of illustrating the analysis of risk. It's a combination of the likelihood of a threat materializing and the impact on the organization or the business process if and when it does. From an ISO point of view, it refers to a risk as being the effect of uncertainty on objectives. The effect on objectives is the impact, and uncertainty is the likelihood. And so it's some combination of likelihood and impact, and the majority of organizations will use some kind of scale like this 1 to 5 and use simple arithmetic to say that the impact multiplied by the likelihood gives us a value of between 1 and 25, and that's how we analyze risk. Of course, there are no real units of measure for this, and it's not that scientific, but what's important is that if we use this approach for all the risks we identify, it means we're doing it consistently, and therefore the results are capable of comparison. So one risk that is likelihood level 2, and impact level 5 is, as we can see, it has a mathematical or an arithmetic value of 10, and according to the red zone there, it is unacceptable. Whereas one with an impact of 2 and a likelihood of 5 is also unacceptable. But notice the that red zone, the unacceptable risk zone, is not entirely symmetrical. It's got an additional red square on the bottom row above impact 4, and that's to do with the organization's risk appetite. It is more averse to anything of high impact, regardless of the likelihood. So that's an example of a slightly more sophisticated approach to risk appetite. And in that way, you cannot use pure arithmetic to decide whether a risk is acceptable or not. That requires a slightly more sophisticated numerical analysis. Anyway, that's risk analysis. It's combining likelihood and impact and coming up with some sort of value. Now, how do we measure impact? Well, many organizations talk about high, medium, low, or insignificant, minor, moderate, major, catastrophic, things like that. But actually, there's no consistency because different people will interpret words like catastrophic as being different levels of actual impact. On the left there's an idea as to, from an organizational point of view, what do these sort of numbers or levels should they mean? And on the right is an example of an impact scale that based on something that was a real project where there are units of measure, and there is the easiest unit of measure for impact, of course, is money, because that's common to all organizations, and whether it's pound sterling in the UK or euro or US dollars or whatever it might be, it's a common unit of measure that people can understand and can compare things with. For many people doing BIA, it might be easy, and indeed risk assessment, it might be easier to express the level of impact in something other than money if that person doesn't understand the financial workings of the organization. So there's various forms of impact, such as reputational, operational types of impact, but ultimately they must all correlate with the central and common value, usually of money. So that's fairly summary level, a bit about establishing an impact scale or impact criteria. What's important is that people who are going to do risk assessment and BIA can select a level, what in this case 0 to 5, on a basis which is entirely consistent with other assessments and other people. When it comes to likelihood, this is even harder really to deal with. Again, people talk about very high or very low, but again, what does that mean? And really the most common and I have to say successful way of establishing it is based on the typical frequency, and what you see there is a very common scale of impact used in many organizations around the world. A disruptive incident may happen quite frequently, which is more than once a year, or very infrequently every 10 years or more, something like that. But it doesn't really matter whether it's 2 to 3 years or 1 to 2 years or 3 to 4 years. What's important is that the same scale is used consistently across all of the risks. So to do analysis, we identify some risks, we estimate the likelihood and impact, and using this system here, we come up with a numerical score. That doesn't work perfectly with the evaluation model because of the shape of the risk appetite that I mentioned earlier. So the risk E, which has a numerical value of 4, well, there isn't one in the other square with a value of 4, but they're both of them are green. So it's a distorted risk appetite. So you can use arithmetic if you use an entirely symmetrical evaluation grid, but if you're using as it were a shaped risk appetite, then you need another approach to identifying whether the risk is acceptable or not. The point being, though, that whatever it is, it's always consistent because the same process is used. So we identify and evaluate, and analyze risks. And conceptually, the evaluation is putting them into those squares on the heat map, which determines whether they're acceptable, unacceptable, or something in between, which is what the amber section indicates. And here is an example of an actual risk register. It's been anonymized to protect the guilty, but it's just an example of one. It's very common to use a spreadsheet for this. We can have things like functions, categories, the description of the risk, where it is. It's useful to know about existing controls that are in place, and then using a simple arithmetic process to do the analysis and come up with a score, which then is effectively evaluated in this process, so that we get a green for acceptable, red for unacceptable, and amber for something in between. And amber could mean things like it's acceptable but requires more frequent review, or it could mean it's unacceptable but we have longer to address it, or anything else that the organization wants to do. But whatever that anything else is, it needs to be consistently applied. And of course, sorry, just going back to that one, the point about the unacceptable ones, or in or out of tolerance, as it says in that example, is that the red ones typically, and possibly the amber ones, would require either a BCM control, some sort of business continuity plan and related arrangements, or something else which reduces either the likelihood or the impact, or possibly and quite often a combination of the two. Then we come on to the BIA, which of course helps us to determine the recovery priorities, the recovery requirements for individual activities, because to recover all activities in an organization at the same time, to treat everything the same, is likely to be highly cost inefficient. There are going to be some activities that need to be recovered very quickly, perhaps within minutes or hours, and there are others which don't need to be recovered for, say, days or even weeks or possibly even months. And in order to optimize the cost effectiveness of business continuity management, it's important that the recovery priorities are commensurate with the criticality of the activity. Otherwise, it's going to be very expensive. I've identified on the second call out there the recovery time objective, which is a well-known expression and acronym used in many organizations. ISO 22301 refers to this as prioritized recovery timeframes, but it really does mean the same thing. Above that, we have the concept of maximum tolerable period of disruption, and ISO 22301 also uses the term maximum acceptable outage for the same thing. It's the maximum amount of time within which an activity can remain disrupted before the impact becomes unacceptable. And from that, we determine then through the BIA process what the recovery time objective should be. We need to take into account things like seasonal variances, but the key outputs are, as you can see there, that we need to know what the activities are, what the preferably the normal and the minimum acceptable levels, or the MBCO, and the recovery time objective. And also for systems, at the bottom there, we've got the RPO, the recovery point objective for data. Many people in organizations who aren't close to business systems will assume that a recovered system will be completely up to date with regard to the data that goes with it. And of course, very often it's not, because the recovery process may involve the restore of data, which could be hours, days, or even weeks old from the last backup, whatever form that backup takes. So identifying recovery point objective for systems is going to be very critical to whether or not the business activity is capable of recovery operationally, as well as just having people in place. Now, there is a standard that accompanies ISO 22301 called 22317, and it's about business impact analysis. Now, the reason that box at the bottom is flashing there is because really BIA is about activity prioritization. And I'm really just telling you about ISO 22317 just so that you know that it exists. If anybody ever says to you, surely there must be something about how to do BIA within this ISO world. Well, there is this standard. It doesn't actually tell you how to do the BIA. What it does do is set out the overall process within which BIA sits. It does indicate there that what we're looking for is to identify the products and services and the activities that support those products and services, and for those activities to be prioritized so that through top management endorsement of results or approval of results, we identify the business continuity requirements, and from that we can say what the strategy might be. If we've got plenty of time, the strategy could be along the lines of, well, we'll wait until the dust has settled, then we'll go back in, repair the building and replace it with all shiny new furniture and carry on. If there is very little time, then the strategy would probably be along the lines of having some kind of contingency arrangement for workspace and fast systems recovery, and maybe spare stock of supplies or products and things like that. But it depends very much on the nature of each organization. But central to this is activity prioritization. Now, for an organization doing a BIA for the first time, there's some considerations, and these are included in ISO 22317. Many of them are fairly self-evident, but obviously in order to do this, you've got to identify the products and services, and many people fall into the trap with the BIA of simply coming up with recovery requirements for resources such as systems. That's very common. But what this really needs to do, if it is to be truly analytical, is that it should be based upon the activities and the recovery time objective for them. So in order to do that, you've obviously got to identify the activities which support products and services. Anyway, there's a set of 9 things there that this standard 22317 suggests are useful. I'm not going to go through them in detail. You will get a copy of these slides following the webinar, so you'll be able to see this for yourselves. So they'll make fairly good sense. Again, what it doesn't do though is to tell you how to do a BIA. So I'm moving in that direction now. Let's talk about what you have to do to conduct a BIA. Well, we've got to have our criteria. We've talked about impact, and here's yet another example of how to set an impact scale. And creating this impact scale, by the way, is quite an intuitive process. If you're going to use a financial impact as the common form of impact, how do you decide how much money applies to a very low level of impact or a very high level of impact? And obviously you've got to think about, for this fictitious organization, we're talking about £5 million or more being the highest level of impact that we would measure, the catastrophic level. Now, if that organization has a turnover of 4 million, then clearly that 5 million or more is probably never going to, well, it depends on the business, but it's probably never going to be hit by anything. At the same time, if it's an organization turning over, say, 500 million, then 5 million is, well, it's 1%, isn't it? It's not going to be catastrophic, probably. So getting the financial level right is important. And from the financial levels, you can then go on to establish equivalent other levels, such as you can see, their reputational or loss of production resource. We also need to identify the resource dependencies. This is not part of determining the recovery time objective, but it's one of the key outputs of a BIA is to determine what resources are needed to recover. This is based on a real project, and this organization was able to classify its business resources in those 4 different areas, and this was a simple data collection sheet that was used to collect from each different activity. So the activity in question was data management, and the people representing that were able then to look at the 4 different types of resource, and then horizontally select the number of well, obviously there isn't a number of applications, but the number of resources in each case that they would need. They were able to select what type of resource it was. And using a data collection sheet like this with filtering means that people can't just randomly describe all sorts of resources that then cannot be found or referenced. So we're using data here to establish, of the business as usual resources, what do people think they would need for a recovery scenario. The interdependency I mentioned earlier, again, this is an example of a simple data collection sheet where the owner of the process is asked to say what activities does it depend on. So if you look at the red arrows, brand management as an activity depends on the communication activity. It could live without the communication activity for 2 days. That's the tolerance column. And it depends on it to a level of 60%. Now, for this particular organization, they were able to say how critically dependent they were on other, usually upstream activities. So, and we built rules into this so that if the criticality or the dependency was beyond a certain level, then it became part of the critical path for recovery plans. And then horizontally, it could go on and identify other activities that it was dependent upon. And that's really important when you think about the results of all of this, that in business continuity plans, you don't have functions or departments or teams with good plans. They get into their recovery situation all ready to go and they can't do anything because another function in the organization isn't even there. So that's one of the key dependencies. As well as resources, we've got other processes. When we look at each individual activity, and this is a very simple example, we might, what ISO 22301 asks for is that we identify impacts over time, because obviously the impact of disrupting an activity will change over time. Typically, it'll start relatively low and it'll increase and increase over time in different rates or in different ways. And there's just a fairly simple example there that you can see how for each of those activities, the impact starts either at 0 or 1, and in some cases ends up at level 5, and in one case only 2. And sometimes that can be a surprise to the process owner. And the timeline that we've used there as an example, again, that's arrived at intuitively. The organization would need to work out what is the earliest point following a disruption that impact would start to become measurable, and what is the latest point at which impact is likely to continue to change. So half a day through to half a year is used by some organizations, but that might be too long a timeline for many. If we take the results of that data and conceptually plot it on a chart like this, it gives us an indication for how the impact of disrupting all of those different activities changes over time. And in order to to determine a maximum acceptable outage or a maximum tolerable period of disruption, if we look at where the level of impact crosses an impact threshold, which is indicated by that red arrow, then we can see the point in time at which impact would reach its maximum allowable level, so the maximum acceptable outage point. Normally those points on the timeline would be expressed in terms of hours or days or weeks or months or whatever is appropriate. So that gives us, the point about these is that it's not scientific, but it gives us a relative priority between the different activities. Once we've done that, we can then take the information, put it into a table like this, whether we call it MAO or MTPD, same thing, or RTO. Typically the RTO, the recovery time objective, wants to be a bit shorter than the maximum acceptable outage, just to provide a margin for error. So if we take those results and simply sort them in time order, we can then see fairly clearly a timeline for activity recovery. And that's really the primary output of a BIA, is to determine when each activity needs to be recovered following a disruption in order that the impact does not extend beyond an acceptable level. That's one of the, probably the most important key output of a BIA. In some organizations, people simply decide on RTOs. That isn't a BIA because they haven't analyzed impact. And business impact analysis, I think we can say, means that you need to analyze impact. And ISO 22301 does say that the BIA should take into account impact as it changes over time. So the results of doing this then are that we have this conceptual recovery timeline with, as you can see there, I've simply positioned the different activities where they would fall along that timeline. The key thing is that the results are analytical. We've done the analysis, we've compared all of the activities or the impact associated with them with each other. By using a consistent set of measurement criteria, it means that even if we use different people, the analysis, or rather the assessment of impact at each point in time, is going to be consistent. In some cases, the BIA might be impractical. So for something, for example, that requires special purpose machinery, to find out from the BIA that it's got a recovery time objective of 2 days might be utterly impractical. If we find out that the special purpose machine that we need, it's much too expensive to have a spare one, and we haven't got the space for it anyway, and to buy a new one, it takes 6 months. So sometimes the strategy, well, in that case, the strategy is definitely going to be informed by the BIA. But management should review the results of the BIA, because very often top managers might be able to see something that doesn't look quite right, and they can ask for something to be looked at again. It's not a perfect science after all. So this timeline informs the business continuity plans via the strategy, I would say. I already mentioned this general principle that activity recovery is the preferred risk control solution. And stemming from the RTO for activities, we then have, I wasn't able to show them individually, but we then have the recovery time objectives for the resources that support them. And again, in the example I just gave about a machine, that could be something that directly impinges on the strategy, because something might not be available within the desired timescale. So from this information, we can do strategy selection. We can work out how the organization might recover, but we need to take into account the different scenarios, because for example, a pandemic illness scenario which deprives the organization of people, the recovery strategy would probably be different from one where the information systems are disabled, or when a factory, for example, is put beyond use. So we could have a range of strategies depending upon the different scenarios that we have. So there's just a few key points about BIA. Both risk assessment and BIA contribute to that. They're important contributors to strategy selection, because in strategy we need to take into account the scenario in which business continuity arrangements would be needed. They're going to be different arrangements depending upon the scenario, and the BIA is necessary to determine what are the recovery priorities for activities, and what are the resources needed to do that in the event of disruption. And if the likely period of disruption in a given scenario extends beyond the MAO or the MTPD, then that would imply a different scenario. So rather than trying to resume an activity, it might be appropriate to do something else, like outsourcing the activity, or some other similar arrangement that the stakeholders, the customers, the clients would be happy with, would find acceptable. Well, as I mentioned earlier, IT governance is a one-stop shop. In terms of ISO 22301, which is the only internationally recognized standard for business continuity management, there's a variety of things that you can get from us to help you get started or move on. We've got some training courses. We've got some implementation guidance, books, pocket guides, documentation toolkit, which is here. For smaller organizations, we've got a fast track services where we come along and, as it were, do it to you. We can get you to, we can develop a business continuity management system capable of certification to ISO 22301 within about 3 or 4 months. For more complex organizations, larger ones, we could start off with a gap analysis, or indeed go straight into some sort of consultancy proposal to help you to do that. But we very much support people who want to do it themselves, and that's why training is very important, and all of this implementation guidance and things like the toolkits. Just very quickly on the courses, we have 3 courses about business continuity and ISO 22301, a foundation course which is really aimed at people who want to learn a bit more about ISO 22301 and decide whether a business continuity management system is something that they should be having, so they get a feel for what is actually involved in creating one of these and what does it mean for us as an organization. And that's often part of a business case process that many of our clients follow. The lead implementer one then is for people who are already charged with developing a BCMS and often achieving accredited certification. It goes into more detail about how to do all of the bits that are needed to establish a BCMS which meets the requirements of ISO 22301. And we also provide a lead auditor course, because an important part of any management system is maintaining its currency and adequacy, and a key element in that is internal audit. Of course, you can outsource the audit to an organization such as IT Governance, but we do encourage everybody all organizations, if they can, to conduct their own internal audits. It's probably the most cost-effective and actually operationally effective way of doing it. And as you can see, we've inserted a little offer there for you to get 15% discount because you're attending this webinar. Get 15% discount from either the foundation or lead implementer training courses. So do remember that. You'll get these slides, so there'll be a reminder in there for you. So there are various ways of getting in touch with us. Most of you will already know what those ways are. You'll get the slides, so this will remind you. And now it's time for a few questions. So let me just have a quick look and see what we have. Okay, I'll just have a look through some of these questions here. There's a question about how you work out what your impact scale is, how many levels to have, and what they should be. Well, I talked about this earlier, but let me just expand on that. Whether you have an impact scale that goes from 0 to 5 or 1 to 5 or 1 to 4 or 1 to 10 doesn't really matter. Experience though shows that to have sufficient, the ability to sufficiently to differentiate between different situations, having say just high, medium or low is a bit coarse. At the same time, having say 1 to 10, whilst that gives you a finer resolution and better differentiation, it makes the process of using it a bit slower, and it's therefore more labor intensive. So experience shows that a scale of 0 to 5 or 1 to 5 tends to be the most popular. People have tried all sorts. The other point that I mentioned earlier as well is that when you look at working out what sort of financial value might be attributed to those levels, I like to refer to the earnings of an organization. So most people will be familiar with the standard financial parameter, EBITDA, earnings before income tax, earnings before EBITDA, sorry, it's gone completely, it doesn't normally, tax, depreciation and amortization, beg your pardon. Right, so EBITDA is a standard, sorry, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization, beg your pardon. That's a standard financial parameter, and if you think about that, on the slide I showed you earlier, level 5, the most catastrophic or the most serious, would be something that's likely to terminate the organization's existence. And if you know what the EBITDA is for the organization in the current year, you can begin to get a sense of how much loss of value would threaten its existence. At the bottom end of the scale, at say level 1, it's something which is going to be almost routine. So it might be something that's say a few thousand or less. And then what I usually find is that once you've established the top and the bottom levels, you can simply synthesize levels 2, 3, and 4 between them. And it's going to be an exponential scale. It's not going to be a linear scale. So that's the general approach that I use to establishing the impact scale. I've got another question here. Hang on a second. Sorry, I'm just having trouble. Having trouble reading the question. Is there any order to consider the impacts in terms of type of impact, like operational, financial, human resource, statutory? Not really any order. I think for each activity, I wouldn't be looking to assess the impact in multiple ways, because what are you then going to do with the various results you get? You can do that and then maybe take the highest or the lowest or an average or something like that. But the general idea is to keep this process as simple as possible. So it really comes down to who the person is who is doing the impact assessment for each activity, and what is the most suitable scale for them to use. So that's one way of doing it. That's the simplest. As I say, there is another way of measuring or assessing impact from the point of view of money, of reputation, of operational impact, and so on, and then maybe taking an average across them. But it's not really so much an order of priority, although you could prioritize them and weight them if you wanted to. Another question. How much guidance does ISO 22301 provide about BIA and risk assessment? I have to say, not a great deal. I've covered some of the things that it requires. In terms of risk assessment, it asks the organization to identify the operational disruption risks and to treat them appropriately. It then leaves it up to the organization to decide what is an appropriate form of treatment. Is it having a business continuity capability, or is it having something else either instead of that or in addition to it, such as, I don't know, stronger cyber resilience, or having, for example, in information systems, having a better fail or a better failover environment, such as having maybe an active environment infrastructure rather than simply data storage or online backup facility, for example. And so it could be a combination of either of those things, having prevention or having cure. And cure is very often business continuity capability. It doesn't give examples of what a risk register looks like. So it doesn't give examples of any kind of risk measurement process. It doesn't give examples of anything, actually. And in terms of BIA, the same thing is true. What it basically asks is that the BIA takes into account the impact of disruption over time and results in what it calls prioritized recovery timeframes, which is the same thing as the RTO. It really is quite a basic requirement. Now, there's another standard called ISO 22313, which is the guidance for business continuity management. It also doesn't go into any detail of how to do it. And in fact, ISO 22317 that I mentioned a few moments ago doesn't tell you how to do the actual BIA itself. It tells you what the processes should be, but it doesn't give any techniques. And ISO standards don't give techniques. You've got to go elsewhere to find out how to do these things. And there are various tools and books and guides available from people like IT Governance. Right. What is the best risk assessment for office relocation? Well, if I'm seeing all of the question, what is the best risk assessment for office relocation? Office relocation could be two things. In the context of risk, it could be something that if you discover, and I've actually come across a real example of this actually, if you discover that the location of an office gives rise to one or more unacceptable risks, then it may well be that your best risk response to control that risk is to relocate. So that's a simple example of that. The other way that it could play out in business continuity is that in order to reduce the risk of operational disruption, you might split your sites so that you keep the site that you've got and you have another second site somewhere else, so that you don't have all of your eggs in one basket, as it were. And a third way it might play out in business continuity is where office relocation is part of the is part of the response process. So the business continuity plan includes a capability to relocate to a different location. And the point about that, and we're going into another area which we'll probably cover in the next webinar, is that having a planned approach to relocation rather than a knee-jerk tactical response is usually going to be much better. The plan doesn't need to involve a lot of expenditure. It's just having a plan of knowing where to go, what sort of office might be required, how to find availability and things like that. So there's a number of ways in which office relocation could be relevant to business continuity. Should risk registers include business continuity and information governance as points? Yes, they should, absolutely, because business continuity, which is about operational disruption risks, is a risk area which should be part of any corporate risk register. Information governance is another risk area. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's a significant overlap between information availability, and that of course is part of information governance, between that and business continuity, because information is one of the business resources used operationally by virtually every organization. At a corporate risk register level, corporations should have an understanding of their usually their key or most dominant risks in all areas, and of course that will cover things like compliance, and depends on the industry or the sector the organization's in, things like employment law or quality, or all sorts of things, all sorts of types of risks should be in the corporate risk register. And the risks of operational disruption and information governance, or information governance failures actually, should definitely be in there. Yes, there's no doubt about that. But remembering the significant overlap between business continuity and information governance because of the reliance of organizations operationally on reliable information. Let's see if we've got another question here. Risk assessment, so I can't quite read it. The little window they give you isn't very good. Oh, how to do risk assessment between different countries. Well, I think it's as simple as saying that as long as you use a consistent process, then you should be able to use the same process in any country if you've got multiple regional locations. However, when you come down to, for example, I showed you earlier the idea of having a common impact scale based on money. Well, it would simply be a case of coming up with an equivalent financial scale. Now, I think it's not just a question of looking at the exchange rate and converting it from, say, pounds to dollars or pesos or rupees or whatever it might be, because the overall value of the organization isn't necessarily represented in that way. So in a place where the impact of disruption, the financial impact would be much less, then you might want a slightly adjusted scale to indicate the severity of it. Or in a place where the financial impact would be much higher, there might be, for example, regulatory provisions, which means that stopping the delivery of service would incur penalties in some territories where they don't in others. That could be one. I mean, a good example that most people are talking about nowadays, of course, is GDPR. If you have an operational disruption, which means that you cannot meet, for example, a subject access request under GDPR for an EU data subject, then there would be a penalty. But if you have the same disruption in another country that isn't subject to GDPR, then you wouldn't have that impact. You'd have an impact, yes, but it wouldn't be the same. So that's an example of where you might have different criteria, as well as different individual impacts resulting from risks. You've also got the fact that in some territories, risks to do with physical security will be different due to the nature of the different places in the world where they exist. But the key thing is that there is equivalence between the impact scales where money is concerned, but otherwise the process is used consistently between different international operations. The only rider to that point is that risk appetite is really important. And if you remember the red, amber, green matrix that I showed you, the dividing line between red and green, or let's imagine that the amber bit wasn't there. That's effectively what we would call the risk appetite. You might have different levels of risk appetite for different regional operations of an organization, in which case those different regional operations should probably have their own risk registers anyway, because they've got a different risk appetite. They're probably operating on different grounds. So you can either do it as a single risk process across an entire multinational organization, or you can have regionalized, localized risk registers because of things like different conditions and different risk appetites. Hopefully that answers that question. I think we're getting fairly close to the end of the webinar now. There's a couple more questions here. Let me just scroll down. Very small window. Yeah. Software, using software for risk assessment and BIA. I think you can look for yourselves. There are a number of providers around the world who claim to have good software. When I was researching one of my books a few years ago, I did a review of software that I could find. I spoke to a number of organizations, and I have to say I didn't find at the time any software that does everything that is needed for a BCMS. There were one or two products around that offer reasonably good functionality for risk assessment, but BIA, I found there weren't that many that did this. And obviously, I'm not going to mention any specific names on this webinar, but all I can say is caveat emptor. Really, you'll have to look for get demonstrations of those pieces of software. I've come across quite a few that are little more than document templates. Now, having a document template for things like policies and procedures is great, but a document template is unlikely to give you a fully blown BIA, other than maybe listing out activities and then just deciding intuitively what the RTO should be. That's not a BIA, but I've seen examples of what somebody calls a BIA tool, which is a simple document that does that. You could create that yourself. So slightly unhelpfully, I would have to say that there doesn't appear to be a world-beating software package out there that does everything to do with business continuity. And one of the reasons for that is that the size of the market isn't that big. Business continuity management is not taken up as prolifically as information security management. And as I said earlier, my personal view is one of the reasons for that is that business disruption, usually the recipient of the impact is usually a corporation, and the world and the media cares much more about the fortunes of the individual than it does about the corporation. So that could be one of the main reasons for it. I think the other one is that many people running organizations today, they subconsciously think whilst things go wrong for everybody else, it won't happen to them. And then, of course, when it does go wrong, they stand there slack-jawed, thinking, "How could this possibly have happened?" But it does. And of course, by then it's too late. So it's the far-sighted, it's the forward-looking organisations that do something about business continuity. And for the best governance-based approach, following ISO 22301, I think cannot be bettered. And I hope to have covered what a risk assessment and BIA process looks like or might look like within a ISO 22301 based business continuity management system. As I said at the beginning, please do get in touch with us if you like more information. We'll be sending out a copy of the slides to everyone. And do get in touch if there's any way at all in which we might be able to help you, from a free green paper through a simple pocket guide, or maybe something else like a training course, or even some consultancy or gap analysis. So thank you very much for your participation today. I hope you found it interesting. I look forward to speaking to you on the next webinar, which I think is in 2 weeks' time. And I'm just being shown when it is. It's on the 17th of May, and it's about testing and recovery. So I look forward to speaking to you then. And as I say, we'll send you the slides, and please do keep in touch. Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Goodbye.